So my name's Gina, and I work here at the UN Development Operations Coordination Office. Our job is to coordinate the UN system so in its development work. So that's 40 agencies. Most of your agencies are probably members, if not all, working through country teams serving 165 countries. So our niche when it comes to innovation is to directly apply innovation to the function of coordination. And secondly, we've sort of set out and have been trying over the past few years to help scale some of the agency innovations to the rest of the development system. So this is sort of where I'm coming from for the conversation today. We'll talk about these three questions, a bit about what scaling looks like in the social sector, some of the questions that are emerging when it comes to scaling, and then our own work here at the Development Coordination Office on scaling. So in terms of what scaling is in the social sector, there are sort of three main scaling movements, let's say, or scaling types. Scaling out, scaling up, and scaling deep. So scaling out is probably what most of us think about when we reference scaling as a shorthand. We're talking about replicating a solution to more geographical areas to reach more numbers of people. So that's most of the work on scaling is centered on scaling out. Scaling up is the idea that you can have as many good solutions as you want, but if the policy framework, the laws, the rules, the procedures around procurement and finance and legal are not conducive to innovation, they're going to block it. So here, scaling up means removing sort of oppressive rules that get in the way of innovation, or actually enacting kind of game-changing policies. A regulatory sandbox is a good example in financial innovation. If governments, like the UK government, if they don't know if something is legal yet, they'll set parameters on the amount of money or the amount of time that experimenters can play with that. And that is a way of sort of scaling up through policy, making the policy environment conducive to innovation before it knows how to regulate it. Scaling deep is kind of hearts and minds stuff. It's about really like transformational impact at the level of the individual, a community, or an organization. Just to flesh this out a little bit more, let me offer a couple of examples. So in terms of scaling out, so this idea of replication, right? So we've seen through the World Food Programme's Mobile Vulnerability Assessment and through UNICEF's U Report, and also in the run-up to the development of Sustainable Development Goals, where 10 million people were reached through crowdsourcing, including through mobile surveys, not all through mobile surveys, but we've seen this growth of mobile surveys. So what we've done at our office is tried to take the technology and the experience behind those mobile surveys. They're faster. They can reach some people, not others, but they give you a much more real-time finger on the pulse of what's happening. And we've tried to build them into like the mainframe monitoring and evaluation functions of the way the UN plans at country level. So the UN Development Assistance Framework is this kind of overarching document that is meant to capture the UN's footprint in country, and we're building in Rapid Pro Surveyor, which is technology behind at least U-Report's mobile survey. We're building that into the digital system we're building for the way the UN plans. So this is an attempt at scaling out. Scaling up, one of the things we've done is, so again, we see the growth of new sources of data, financial data, mobile phone data, satellite data, social media data, etc. And we see that there's often proof of concept to show that this can teach you something about sustainable development. So what we thought we would do in terms of scaling up would be to build a policy that is a bit of a risk management tool, right? It provides for data protection, ethics, etc., for the use of big data in Agenda 2030, and thereby provides policy cover for anyone who wants to try it out there in the UN system. So this is then a policy that applies throughout the UN system, and we're saying we authorize this new method, and here's what you need to know while you do it. When it comes to scaling deep, in terms of culture, so just as an example of this, I think a lot of us have worked with new methods or new data where we test it out and we show it's possible. the challenge I always find is getting people to actually use that new data or that new method or that new technology to change the way they make operational decisions, right? So my dream, I don't know it's realized yet, but it's my dream, is that management sort of makes operational decisions based on the new methods and data and tech that innovation teams develop, right? That they beg for it, they ask for it, they say, no, I'm not going to make that budgetary decision until you show me the predictive analytics on what it's going to affect. That's a sort. It's not a real example yet. It's just a hypothetical dream. Oh, sorry. Here, I'm going back. So just to add a little more complexity to the scaling landscape, lately there have been a bit of a focus more on scaling, more on the context in which solutions are applied than the homogeneous replication of one solution again and again and again. So there's a couple pieces here that you might want to look at, which are down in the corner of the slide, from In with Forward and from Apolitical. But just to explain here, so scree scaling, scree is the buildup of many little rocks near like a cliff. And sometimes those many little rocks can become their own mountain. So scree scaling is this idea that it's not about finding the one big idea silver bullet that needs to be replicated all over the place. It's many small ideas that accumulate, you help proliferate, you legitimize, and that actually may lead to culture change, it may lead to policy change, etc. So it might be that, you know, in mental health, you see a lot of innovations happening which are very low tech, right? Like in North America, they find that barbers, when they talk to men who get their haircut, can have much more insight into prediction of suicide based on some of the indicators if the barbers are trained to pick up certain behaviors when they're cutting men's hair. And this has worked much better than men going to see a therapist, which is difficult culturally. In Zimbabwe, you have people sitting on park benches all day, hanging around, and also talking to people and dispensing mental health care. So these are very small ideas which might not be the same over and over again, but they may build up into a massive change that could revolutionize the way mental health care is dispensed. There's another theory here in the yellow bubble about that really you shouldn't focus on replicating solutions. You should actually focus on building the research and development infrastructure that allows continuous experimentation and innovation, right? So you kind of tend to the ground that could create possible innovations rather than focusing on scaling one innovation in particular. So here the thinking is, in the private sector, there's a very clear route from a hypothesis and a proof of concept and a prototype to getting more capital, getting more talent, getting more networks, etc. In the social sector, we need to build this up, right? Many innovators test something out, they wade through the jungle, they go through they fight all the rules, and they get on the other side, and there's no path to, you know, kind of the promised land of scaling. So the thinking here is you need to focus on the infrastructure for social research and development. And then finally, there's also some thinking that the really good solutions are going to be too bespoke to scale. They're too specific to actually go wide, and maybe scaling is not appropriate for every innovation. So some of the emerging questions when it comes to scaling, I'll just put these three out there, and we can talk about it in the discussion. So first is, what should be scaled, and actually who decides, right? There can be a very market-driven mechanism where things just happen organically. Others think there need to be sort of vetting, almost in a committee style of determining what should scale. So this is an open question. There is a principle that you should plan for scale from the beginning, but I think there are questions on how you really do this. Mostly in my experience, if you're testing something really new, you're keeping it under the radar for a while. And you're just trying to prove that you know what you're talking about and that the hypothesis is right, and that maybe there is a there. And it's often very difficult to, from the beginning, design in a way that's absolutely ready to go live everywhere. This can be done better when it comes to, I think, technology, and less so when it's a non-tech innovation. And then finally, there's this question of whether scaling out or replication is always the objective, right? Whether that's appropriate for everything, whether that's a measure of success for everything. So these growing sprouts are maybe a good visual to think about your innovation portfolio. Many people manage this way. So the little sprout on the left, the little guy, might be your kind of frontier, high-risk innovation, right? You're just testing it out. You're seeing if it works. It might not be ready to scale from the beginning because honestly, you don't even know if it works. The middle ground are kind of the medium risk things that you think could work. They need to be adapted to scale, and you go from there. And then the tallest ones are really proven solutions where the evidence base is there. You're handing over to partners, and at that point, it may not even still count as innovation. It might be more like optimization and regularized efficiency. So this is a way to think of your portfolio. Many people think the frontier stuff is about 10%. The medium risk is maybe like 30%, depending on your risk appetite. And then the optimization can be the bulk, the kind of remaining 60% of your innovation portfolio. So just to close a little bit on our work at scaling, in DOCO. So we support these 131 UN country teams, which are the constellations of all the UN agencies at country level. And we've been running an innovation facility for 4 years now. Naturally, at the beginning of this year, my manager said to me, well, Gina, enough with 1,000 flowers blooming. When's it going to scale? So we looked at the data, and we created a nice little graphic. And this is what we came up with, right? So of the 131 UN country teams out there, over 80% say they use some form of innovation, right? But when we look at which kinds they use, we don't see any one really penetrating kind of over 50% rate, right? We see hovering around 20 UN country teams using human-centered design, foresight and alternative future, big data, real-time monitoring, innovation camps and labs, mobile feedback mechanisms, etc. But we don't see full penetration. We also kind of felt like this wasn't necessarily the best way to measure scale. So we're trying to now kind of rethink, maybe overcomplicate, but definitely rethink how we strategize for scaling. And first I would say, as you look at this little guy getting spaghetti thrown on him, I mean, on the one hand, our innovation scaling strategy in the UN is always going to be a little bit of throwing spaghetti at the wall. If you, the way I was taught to make spaghetti is when it sticks to the wall, it's done, right? Which is really fun to throw spaghetti at the wall. So no matter what, however designed and integrated and how much we get management on the side of innovation, it's always going to be a little bit of experimentation and seeing what sticks. It's also going to be a little bit of this, right? Where the roots of this tree are growing organically, and they have to grow around these octagons in the pavement. That's the only thing that's available to them. But eventually, they started encircling the octagons, and the structures have to yield. So no matter what we do, the innovation scaling strategy is always going to be a little bit of both of these things, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, and growing around the existing structures and trying to get them to yield. We're trying to shift a little bit our thinking from just funding and supporting and growing and scaling separate innovation projects, and we're shifting to trying to think of a network of connected experiments, right? So these are what we're looking at as kind of 9 elements for next generation United Nations. And here, I think these would be categorized as maybe medium and low risk innovations that might be ripe for scaling. We're looking at collective intelligence. We're looking at foresight and alternative futures to actually make sustainable futures something that's real in people's minds, either using art or data or virtual reality. We're looking at, of course, real-time data, predictive analytics, but making sure that that data is used for empowerment and public accountability. Number 5, the little lady here with the watering can is looking at sources beyond overseas development assistance, so new asset classes, impact bonds, disaster bonds, etc. We're looking at managing UN operations through new technologies. I think we'll hear from Bernard about the work they've done with blockchain. We're looking at using behavioral insights, so applying neuroscience and psychology and marketing to design behavior change initiatives better. Making much more room for science and tech partnerships and managing frontier risks ourselves, and also building the capability to support our national partners to manage those frontier risks. So we're trying to see these as a connected set of like periodic, elements, rather than separate innovation projects. And just to close by saying we are trying to pull these different thinking on scaling, and also the idea of actually connecting experiments in a scaling strategy. So this is something we're working on now, and we'd be really thrilled to have input on from colleagues from the network.